Vaigu Ka Khalsa, Vaigu Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by the Sikh Research Institute. This webinar will begin with a 40-minute moderated discussion between our presenters, after which we will have 40 minutes of Q&A from the audience. So please drop your questions in the chat box and be sure to include your name and city. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to today's panelists. First, we have Deanna Singh. Deanna Singh is an accomplished author, educator, business leader, and champion for marginalized communities. She authored 3 children's books, I Am a Boy of Color, I Am a Girl of Color, and Cloth Crown, and a leadership book, Purposeful Hustle. Singh lives in Wisconsin with her husband, Justin, and 2 sons, Zion and Zephaniah. This February, Deanna will be hosting a 3-day virtual summit, How to Be an Ally, where participants will learn a healthy, positive framework for talking about and taking action on racial equity in the workplace. And I'll be throwing a link for how you can register for that virtual summit in our chat box in a little bit. Next, we have Inni Kaur. Inni Kaur is the creative director at the Sikh Research Institute. Inni Kaur is an esteemed and passionate author, poet, and painter. Recently, she broadened her creative artistry into publishing a children's book series, Journey with the Gurus, that is inspired by the life and teachings of Guru Nanak Sahib. Her other children's books are Saki Time with Nani Ji, Thank You Vaheguru, Daddy's Turban, and The Story of Us. Today, she resides in Fairfield, Connecticut, USA, and continues to bring multifaceted perspectives to her work. And lastly, we have Simran Jeet Singh. Simran Jeet Singh is a writer, teacher, scholar, and activist. Simran is the author of a new children's book from Penguin Random House, Fauja Singh Keeps Going, the true story of the oldest person to ever run a marathon, the first from a major publisher to feature a Sikh story. Simran is currently writing an adult nonfiction book for Penguin Random House entitled More of This Please, Sikh Wisdom for the Soul. This fall, Simran is teaching a program at Columbia University and Trinity University, excuse me, on anti-racism as a spiritual practice. Please welcome today's panelists.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today.
Great. Thank you all for being here today and for everyone celebrating, whether it's Bandi Chor Divas or Diwali. I think this is a great way to start our day. The story of Bandi Chor Divas is dear to the community, as we know, and what better way than to start the day by speaking about narratives and storytelling. So particularly Bandi Chor Divas is not only a story of the Guru as liberator, but it's also a story of human rights and vastness. But it's also a story that's seldom known. I know it's not a story that I heard until I sought it out myself. So today we are joined by 3 trailblazers in their fields, Deanna Singh, Inni Kaur, Simran Jeet Singh, who will be speaking about their work within the field of children's books, which I think is very prominent that we are speaking about it on this day. So as we think about stories and what stories get told, I think in the COVID era, narratives around Sikhs have really focused around Sikhs serving langar, or particularly where I'm located in Canada, unraveling their dastars to save individuals who are drowning. But I also think in a post 9/11 world, mainstream ideas of who Sikhs are is at least somewhat clear. We know how popular media portrays Sikhs as IT specialists, as cab drivers, as convenience store owners, or as goofy sidekicks. We even, I think, sometimes do it to ourselves, where we create caricatures of our own communities. But like I said, today's panelists who are joining me today are challenging these narratives through children's books, among their vast other avenues where they're doing this challenging as well. They challenge these narratives through what I believe are true characters. So with that, I'll begin our conversation, and I'll give my first question to Simran Jeet. Simran Jeet, thank you for joining us. I think generally the audience is aware of the significance of representation and what sharing diverse stories means, especially in spaces like children's books. But what is the danger of a single story? particularly, as I said, in a post 9/11 world, and I know you've spoken about this in your work. Yeah, what is the danger of a single story, and how does your work take that into consideration?
I appreciate that, and I agree with you that many in the audience will be aware of the ways in which Sikhs are portrayed or actually not portrayed, right? Like a lot of our experience in North America, especially, has been one of invisibility, right? People see us, but they don't know who we are, and we don't show up in popular culture in any way. And that is a really painful experience for many of us and our families. This is something my parents struggled with when they first moved to the country. What does it look like to find justice and fairness for your kids in a world where people don't even know who you are and they don't care, right? That's a real challenge. And so one of the things we've seen, and one of the things I've actually struggled with myself in the post 9/11 moment, is that there have been more opportunities for Sikhs to become known. Um, the challenge is there's been a singular framework for the most part around how those stories are told, and that's through the story of victimization, right? People will, in the States at least, and I've worked a lot, especially with the Sikh Coalition on the media side of things, the only time people want to tell our stories, the only time people are interested in us is when we are dealing with the hate crime situation. And I think that's important, right? It's helpful to have that attention for multiple reasons, right? For advocacy, for policy, just for connecting and creating awareness. But it's really flattening. It's really dehumanizing when your entire personhood or your entire community is only seen through a single lens, right? Like that creates, it's a better problem than not being seen, but it's still a problem. And what we really need is to have multiple lenses, right? Like if we are real people who are dynamic and robust and diverse, then that has to be shown. And so the challenge for us has been, and it continues to be, how do we break through that singular framework of victimhood and start telling our own stories in ways that reflect who we are as people? The authenticity that comes with that only comes when we are telling those stories. So I think there's a need for us as a community to seize power, right? To say we will tell our stories and we can tell our own stories. And that's what I love about what Deanna and Inni and so many others are doing in the community right now in a way that we haven't really seen before. In terms of my own book with Fodja Singh, that was a major impulse for me. How do we train on how Sikhs see themselves, right? We don't see ourselves as victims. That's not part of our worldview. We see ourselves as resilient. We see ourselves as optimistic and living in Jardikla. And so Fodja Singh, meeting him and spending time with him really sort of spoke to me about a way in which we could share a beautiful story with the world that brings out these multiplicities of our identities, the richness of who we are, a different way of thinking about what our heroes can look like. Right? Like you have somebody who not just is a Sardar, but also somebody who is an immigrant, somebody who is elderly, somebody who's dealt with disability. From a justice lens, this brings intersectionality to our new vision of a hero. But from a community perspective, this helps us go beyond that singular and dehumanizing lens of victimization into something that's far more authentic and far more helpful for us as a community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Simran Jeet. I appreciate that perspective and the intersectionality that goes into character making, because I think it really speaks to our lived realities as intersectional individuals. So Deanna, I'm going to relegate my next question to you. In your work, you speak a lot of two realities: this reality within your home, and then the reality outside of it. And then I know in our conversation beforehand, you spoke about the reality within the Gurdwara in which the 2012 Oak Creek massacre occurred, and then the reality of the Gurdwara that you were at across town. Could you speak a little to these apparent dual realities and how we make sense of, and perhaps, as you say, bridge the two?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say a big thank you to the Sikh Research Institute and for the invitation to be here, and a big thank you to everybody who's watching. I think this, and I want to just make a quick comment on what Simran said too. It's this idea of being able to bring in and have power over our own narrative that is the most motivating factor. I think in the work that I do, not to speak for them, but in the work that Simran does and the work that Inni does, that this idea of being able to control some of the story and really tell the story from from our own perspective, and give it all of the beautiful flavor that it requires in order for people to fully understand it. There's something so powerful. There's something that gives me tingles when I think about doing the work and doing the work through that lens. And so it's just an honor to be able to be here, to have this conversation, to be on the phone with two of the people that I'm a huge fan of, and to be able to share the platform with you. So I first just wanted to say, it was just a moment of gratitude, because again, you can write these things and you can do these things and put them out into the world, but until somebody actually sees the work and somebody reflects it back to you, it doesn't feel real. And so in many ways, this is a big moment for me as an author. It makes me feel more real, not just that the story is out there, but that people are listening and people care. And I think it gets right to your question, Mavinder. When you're talking about this idea, of dual realities, like what is happening inside your home and what is happening outside your home. I think for me as a child, one of the big things, and the reason why I kind of describe this, is that inside our house, now I live in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area. Inside our house, it almost felt like the same as it does when I go home, when I'm in, our bin. It smells the same. We do the same things, right? We have the same joy. There's just something about it that no matter whether I'm in India or if I'm in, this suburban area, it feels like home. And there's a sense of being able to show up fully and completely with all that we are. And I think as a child, one of the things that I really struggled with is that, I'd leave my house and go into a world where nobody understood what was happening in my home, where everything that happened in my home seemed really, really exotic, right? And seemed like this other thing. And I felt often as a child that I had to make a choice, that I couldn't have both. I could be, Indian, I could be, I could have roti and dal, and I could speak in Punjabi, but I could only really do that at home. And at Gurdwara, maybe at my auntie's house, or, but just only in those places. But then I had to be very different, right? When I was outside of that space. And I think those realities competed for me as a child. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to write The Cloth Crown is because I wanted to show that those realities don't have to compete. As a matter of fact, when those two realities exist together, first of all, they do coexist together, regardless of what anybody says. I am the same person when I'm here at home as I am when I'm in the community. So they already do coexist. But to give some narrative to that, to show what it really feels like, to show the challenges in those moments. And so, when you talk about these dual realities, for me, one of the way to bring them together is to tell stories, right? And to bring people into those spaces. And so one of my favorite things to do is to say, can I tell you what it felt like to grow up as a biracial woman in a suburb of Milwaukee? Can I just tell you what that was like, and how it was hard, and what was awesome about it? And I think that's a really big thing. I think the other thing that I've found to be really powerful, and Simran, I really appreciate what you said. So that's kind of talking about home and outside of home. But to the second part of your question, and really speaking to the massacre of 2012, on that day, we were actually holding a kanbar at the Gurdwara. My son was just born. He was just 3 months old. We were there. It was early in the morning. My family was getting all the food together. And I remember sitting on the floor, and I remember as things started to unfold around us, just thinking I can't believe this is happening in such a sacred place. And even though it wasn't happening in the Gurdwara that we were in, it was happening in the Gurdwara across town from us. There's only 2 Gurdwaras in this area, right? So it was, in the other one, I couldn't help think, what does this mean, right? What does this mean for me in this moment, and how will I tell this story to my children? Like, how will I be able to communicate to them not only how we responded, but who we are as a people and how this influenced us in this moment? And so, to Simran's point, I think one of the things I've really tried to emphasize is that I'm glad that you're here, and I want to tell you who we are in this moment of tragedy. Like, look at how we have shined even in this moment of tragedy. But I also want you to be here tomorrow. Right. And I want you to come back to this. I want you to come back to this community in more than just our painful moments. I want you to come back to this community in our moments of joy, too, in our moments of celebration. And so I think that also, at least for me, infused it. I didn't know at that moment, right? Sitting in, I had lots of things going through my mind. I didn't know in that moment that a book would come out of it. But I think it's appropriate, right? That some piece of art would come out of it, because there's this bigger story that's not just about what happened in that moment. It's this bigger story of what's happening around us all of the time.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I found particularly poignant about you telling that story, was the response. And I thought that was a great way of understanding and thinking through such a tragic moment. So thinking more widely about representation and the characters that we portray, I know, Inni Kaur, some of your work differs from the other panelists as it explicitly tells stories rooted in Sikhi, and your latest work kind of implicitly invokes representation, where one of the characters just happens to be Sikh. Could you share a little bit about this journey of how you've understood representation?
Definitely. I'll speak to that, but it's really great to be here with Deanna and with Simran to speak about something which is so dear to my heart. To Deanna's point, when she was talking about the massacre in Wisconsin, we don't have a book to honor, to capture that. But then we also do not have a book on 1984, right? And why is that? That's the question. So those are the things that, yes, while we celebrate, we must also honor the things that have happened to us as a community. Because if we do not tell that story, no one's going to tell that story. And who best than the people who have been through the process and suffered at multiple levels. That story, 84, touched each one of us at a very different level. Wisconsin touched us at a very different level because of time. What if we had something that would bridge that, as how do the Sikhs respond to that, but also to tell that in a way where it is not, as what Simran has said, and Deanna, that being the victim. I mean, that's the danger of that one story, of always talking about the bullying, which is important. But when you just focus on that moment, you've actually made us to be much smaller than we are. So to your point, Manvinder, you asked, my first focus was actually the faith, the guru, because we did not, and I still say that, the books that I grew up with biblical stories. I did not know Sakhis. I did not know the parables of the faith. I grew up with biblical stories, beautiful books, illustrated, German illustrations, literally magical about the life of Jesus. And literally, I was drawn to it. And then when my children were born, there was nothing like that I could give them. I mean, keep in mind, if I'm giving them Angelina the ballerina, and then I'm also giving them something which has been produced from India, which is on, less than adequate paper, the illustrations and the English is that you're creating a difference right there. And so I began a little bit of storytelling to them about the guru, right? The little bit that I knew. And then later on, it really dawned on me, and the boys spoke, that you need to do this. And it was an uphill battle because there was nothing, I knew what I wanted, but not having entered that field, I was not an author, but I knew I needed to do that. So of course it took time. It's been, 10, 11 years now. And it was really critical for me for the children to fall in love, or the children to have something magical in their hand, that magic feeling. And I wanted the children to be able to take that book to school, because I'm, being an educator, I'm very aware that the children have independent reading, but they couldn't take any of our books to school because they were not worthy of their teacher approving. And for me, the highlight moment was when the children said, this Journey with the Gurus got approved by my teacher. I mean, for me, that was it. Yes, it's gotten into where that child is comfortable enough to show it to his friend, to show it to her teacher, and okay with it. So my focus was really on the Gurus, and then also then it came into how do we celebrate, because the children want to be able to celebrate. We have bar mitzvah, we have christening, we have all these other things. What do our children have? Hence the title came of, the name came, Namkaran ceremony, the naming ceremony. And the second was Dastar Bandi, which speaks to that narrative of building the child. But my other story speaks to actually more so to Deanna and Simran Jeet, what they were talking about, the story of bus. That is where I bring in the principle of the faith, Ikunkar, without really going there, it's that oneness. Deanna, you talk about that in your home you felt safe and, or you were fully present. Well, in my home growing up, I was adored, right? By my grandfather, by my mother, my father, and my sister. I was adored. But I stepped out of that house and I was a child that was the last one to be picked to be on anyone's team. I was a child that was called black. I was a child that was said, if you touch her hand, you're going to get black. I was a child who went to, parents' homes, my friends' homes, and at, milk and cookie time, the mothers would say, if you don't drink your milk, you will be as black as Inni. So I grew up with that. So for me, Story of Us was when I was reading the book by Nayan Chandan, and he, in that first chapter, he said, we are all from Africa. It was like an aha moment for me. And I knew that I needed to write that book. I needed to write that for myself. And to be able to show that we come from the one place, we are the one, and that entire principle of Ekunkar was right there. So that's why I didn't want to highlight any child. We're all one, and just have one Sikh character there. And the children have said, oh my gosh, there's a Sikh in the book. Because that's what I wanted it to be now. It's like, they're just part of the fabric. They are one, they are part of it. It's not a separate story. That same weight, I wanted them to have the same weight and the same voice, that they are one. That difference I wanted to take away from that. That was, and that's pretty much now where I want to focus. I do want to finish the series of the celebrations of what we have, the milestones, but I want to focus more on that, the oneness, the Ikunkar principle of the faith, without making it religious, but definitely that underlying factor that we are one, that oneness, and how do we embrace that in every shape, way, or form.
Thank you for that. I think, even just hearing the three of you speak, I think we hear the different characters that can be illuminated from within the community. And I think these varying understandings and ideas of representation are just that. They vary for all of us. And I know, Simran Jeet, your work touches upon these motifs of representation in mainstream media, along with everyone else's as well. And in our current moment, when hints of representation are popping up. So particularly I'm thinking about VP-elect Kamala Harris. So these hints of representations are emerging, and these moments of representation have come before. They've emerged before. So what do these these glimpses of representation, what have they meant historically, and what do they mean currently? And particularly here, I'm thinking about the reality of Harris, both her in power and in moments where she's validated institutionalized racism. So yeah, thinking about these nuanced examples, what has representation meant historically and currently, and how can we think through it and maybe critique it?
Yeah, that's such a great framing of the question. It's not uncommon for us to get questions around representation. It's very uncommon to have such a nuanced approach, even in the way you articulated it, because the standard, there are two ways in which people typically talk about representation. They will either say representation is all we need to achieve liberation and justice in our society, or they'll say representation is just a facade and it doesn't actually do anything or change anything. And so those two perspectives sit on opposite poles of the spectrum. But I think what you're implying in your question, and where I stand with it, is that it's somewhere in between. That representation is progress, especially in a world where we haven't had seats at the table for people of different backgrounds, including for Sikhs. But it's not going to solve all our problems, right? There's something more that needs to be done. And your example of Kamala Harris is a very good one, that there is a lot of power in having a woman of color, a Black woman, a Desi woman, in this high office. But as we all know, and those of us who are engaged in conversations around race and racism often, there's a lot of internalized racism. There's a lot of internalized oppression, and each of us, turns that around and harms people in different ways. So it's just a very helpful framing for us to even just acknowledge that representation isn't going to solve all of our problems, right? Like that's not what our life experiences tell us. Like you said in your question, Manvinda, we've seen representation before. There are still problems, right? So that can't be true. It's also not what Sikhi teaches us, right? Like what Sikhi teaches us is you do the work, right? You keep going and you work with justice. And this is, to me, a sign of progress, but it's not the solution. So what's the value here, I guess, is the question. And there are a number of ways in which we can think about it. In children's literature, why does representation matter? There's a lot of children's writers, and the scholar brought up this idea, talk about windows and mirrors. And it really resonates with me. What they mean by windows and mirrors is you can create empathy and humanize people by giving them windows through which they can see people and have experiences that they wouldn't otherwise, right? So imagine a white kid sitting in Texas, where I grew up, seeing this book with the Sardar protagonist, and just seeing them as a family, as good people, as people who have challenges and overcome them, right? Like that's a way of connecting. But it's also a mirror. It's a mirror for us and our kids, who can then imagine themselves as being the protagonists of their own story, as having resilience and perseverance and all these values that we want to instill. And so that's one example, right? Like I'm thinking of my own daughters seeing Vice President Kamala Harris as a Desi woman and saying, oh, that might be possible for me one day. And I think the reason that we know this to be true is we've all had experiences, including myself, of setting limitations on, like me growing up in sports. Like it was really hard to imagine being a professional athlete because I didn't see any Sikhs in that world. And the same is true across the board in all of our spheres, right? And so there's something really powerful there. The other thing I want to say is that when we increase representation and we have diversity at the table and we bring our voices to the table, then we have the possibility of doing better, right? So like there are lots of ways in which Sikhs and other minority communities are harmed by policies that would not that are not malicious in nature, but have just been instituted by people who weren't thinking about us in our lives, right? Like a lot of the headwear policy. I mean, it takes sports for an example. A lot of headwear policy is not considering, they were not written to exclude. It's not intended that way. But there just wasn't that sort of representation at the table. And so this is progress in that sense too. It will set us up for dealing with the direct forms of racism that we encounter by creating connection, but it'll also help us deal with institutional racism that our community struggles with, and create more opportunities for equity and justice that we can all have. And so that to me is the value of the progress. And we want to be mindful of, it's not going to solve all of our problems, but it can really do some work for us. And it's really important for us to acknowledge that.
If I could just jump on what Simran just said, and actually one of the things that Inni said. So one of the things that I'm able to bring to these conversations, so I want to like hit it right on the head, is that I am African American and I'm also Sikh, right? So I have these two worlds, and I grew up at the intersection of East and West, and grew up, you know, really representing in many ways what President-elect Kamala Harris represents, because that's her background also. And so what I would add, I agree 100% with what Simran said, but I would also illustrate that, or I'd articulate here in this moment that what Inni said is just as important, right? Like that there is some things that are happening within our community where I would get conversations. Are you Indian enough? Are you African American enough? Right. And I think that even during the election cycle, there were a number of people, and I was part of a lot of conversations where people were saying, well, she's not Indian enough. You know, or she's not African American enough. And I think that the other, so I would say that if I added a third thing to what you just said, Simran, is I think there's another part here. There's also a part for us to do some internal work as a community, for us to really think about like, how are we, you know, we're in all these different places all over the world. We are growing in our intersectionality, and how do we create a space that really welcomes the fact that we have these intersections? And so I think there's another opportunity just within our own community, not just, you know, in our representation, not just in what we do, you know, with this moment or what we do when we're at the table, but also like how we're talking about ourselves and how welcoming or non-welcoming we're being for the different things that are happening within the community. I would have loved as a little girl to have a Kamala Harris, because it would have been like validation that I'm okay, right? That it's okay to have this unique mix, as opposed to often feeling like, nope, you have to choose. You can't be both.
Yeah. You know, I mean, when Simran was speaking, a thought came to, and it's because this is just happening right now. When, you know, if you're not on the table and the policies that are created, and right now there seems to be a feeling that people are jumping on this bandwagon, wanting to include everyone in. And I'll give you an example. So I was asked to consult on a book, and it came to me, and, you know, it was a Sikh character. And so I had a, you know, call with the author. I said, why did you choose the name of that, you know, how did you decide that name was the appropriate name? Because this is the main character of the book. And he said, well, I like the sounding of the name. And I said, but this name doesn't fit the community. This name does not represent. Well, I said, are you going to be talking about this man's village? And oh, yes, of course. I said, you haven't done your homework. Just because you like the sound of the name doesn't mean it is the name. And you are basing this entire novel on a, you know, on a Sikh character and the relationship with the World War, you know, whatever. And that part is so dangerous that even we get represented, it's not accurate. It's like, what is this? Yeah. And that's the part where, you know, I don't know if Deanna, you or Simran, where, you know, you want to have more of the say and being at that table. At the table where the publisher are there, or the thing, like, you can't put this out. It doesn't speak to the community. This doesn't fly. Instead of just saying, oh, wonderful, there's a Sikh character, let's publish it. You know, we'll put that check box off. That's not what we want. I mean, that's not what any community wants. And that's a grave injustice to the person who's buying the book and reading and changing that narrative again. So that's what is compelling. I think that's for you, Deanna, also. I mean, that was compelling for me too, that if we have to compromise on what we want the narrative to be, then you've got to publish it ourselves. I mean, for one of the books, for one of my books, I had a publisher, and he asked me quite point blank, he wanted 2 chapters removed. And I said, I cannot. And, when I said why, because I thought it was a space issue. And he said, because they don't fit into his narrative, which he wants to talk about the same. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I can't do it. And quite bluntly, he said to me, he said, do you know what you are giving up? And it's the biggest publishing house in India. They are the one, it was going to be published in 3 languages. And I said, yes. I said, but do you know what I am giving up? I'd never be able to look at myself in the mirror. If the reasons what he gave me were because they're central to the faith,
Mm-hmm.
how could I do that? So it is really a fine line as to when you invest and what you are willing to compromise in the stories. The authenticity of the story, the authenticity of the writer, of the author, is so vital in the stories of communities which are not in the mainstream. That to me is, when people say, why would you do that? It's not for the glory of or to make the money. For heaven's sake, there is no money in this. Everyone thinks you're reaping in the money and it's just flying. Yes, of course, we all know that. But it is so important to be authentic and to tell that story and to leave something for the children. I grew up with, I'm sure, I don't know, Simran, Professor Puran Singh was read 60 years after he died. And his work is so valid today. So at that time period, his work wasn't honored. It is honored now. It's something which we live and breathe. So for me, that's been that moment. I said, if Professor Puran Singh wasn't read, and right now I know what a difference he's making in my life, I am sure what we are doing may not be embraced with that within the community, but it definitely will at some point in time.
I really love what you just said, and I think that's the same motivation. I when I think about meeting Pooja Singh, right? I told this to Simran when I first found out that he was writing the book. I'll never forget that moment, right? I'll never forget what it felt like how proud I was just to be able to stand next to him and to see his kindness, right? And to feel his kindness. And as I was going through your book, I could feel his kindness. I could feel his energy. But that comes when you are able to stay true to the story, when you're able to stay true to the people, that you're represented. In our book, in Cloth Crown, this is not, I wrote this, yes, but many of the words that came from it literally fell out of my father's mouth. Right. They're the stories that I heard. They're how I heard him, talking to my nieces, my nephews, and to my brothers, and the conversations that we had around our own table. So, in many ways, it is. I wrote them, but they're not my words, if that makes sense, right? It's this opportunity to again give life to and to depict something in an authentic way that we've had experience with. And you're right, sometimes we have to do that even if the mainstream is not ready for us. Sometimes we have to do that even if it means we're coming out of our own pocket, or if we're not sure if anybody will ever read it. But sometimes there is something. And you get this feeling, I feel like, as an author, as an artist, and you realize there's something that's way bigger than you. I mean, you know how nerve-wracking it is to write a book about a bug and to be a non-bug wearing woman? This is such a nerve-wracking book. I actually had everything ready to go for about a year before I pushed the enter button to have the book, compiled and put together. Why? Because there was a moment where you're like, is it okay for me to tell this story? And I realized, is this my story? No, it actually isn't, but it's part of my story. And I'm being authentic to it. And as soon as my dad read it, I was like, Daddy G, can you just read it? Make sure, and he read it. I'm like, okay, if nobody else reads it, my dad can smile after he reads it, then I know I've done good, right? And my brother saw it, he read it, he's like, wow, Deanna, like I could see it on his face. I could see the transformation on his face. Okay, right? Then I know,
yeah.
That's the moment, right? When the teacher says, yes, bring that book in, it's okay. Those are the moments that I think create the big movements. It's those little ones, but it's hard.
Yeah, I'll just throw in there. What I'm hearing from the both of you is, and you haven't named it in this way, but I'm hearing it from you, is seva, right? These books they're seva for multiple reasons. And I think there's one more dimension of seva that comes with this work that Inni, you were sort of referring to. Part of what you were describing was this book may not land as well now as it will in the future. But the other thing you're doing, and I mean, I can say this confidently because I've experienced the impact of your work on my own, is you're opening up opportunities for other people to do this work, right? And I think about people like, the first book that we had, a children's book in our home, we grew up with Pushpinder Auntie's The Boy with the Long Hair. And I'm thinking about, the ones we've been reading at our home for years, like Navjot Kaur's books or Jessie Kaur. There's so many. And you're right, like there's no money in it. It's hard work, but people do it for those reasons. And then what that does is it creates more spaces for us to tell our own stories. And so from that perspective, I see this as justice work, right? This is seva in the sense that, my intention is not to, get a book with Penguin and then walk away and keep that relationship to myself. Like what I really want to do is open up floodgates, right? Like let's show these publishers that there is a demand, that there is a connection, that people want these books. Like that's seva as well. And so it's something that you both are doing already, and so many others have been doing, but it's something that really is of consequence for our community.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate this conversation, and I think as we keep going, I think I just keep more and more questions keep popping into my head. But I would encourage everyone who is attending to also throw their questions into the Q&A box, and we can open it up to everyone that's joined us today. Something that I picked up on that the three of you kind of alluded to was this perhaps lack of or an awareness from the community for this representation. Because I think we're talking about, and it's been illuminated, the importance of representation and the various forms that it can take. But I don't think that's always tangible to the community or on a grander scale. So I'll throw this question out to anyone who wants to pick it up. What are some tangible ways that the community can support books by authors who are invested in representing Sikh children in literature?
Buy the books. Tell your friends about the books, right? I think that's probably the simplest thing that you can do. And again, it might sound coy. There's no ill intention behind saying that. The reason why it's important is because when you buy the books and you share them with your children, or you share them with your school, or you share them with your library, what you're doing is you're getting at the core of why we wrote them. You're getting the message out, and you're giving it to people who can see themselves in it. So again, there's no financial gain in this. This is heart work for sure. But the reason why that's important is because the stories, you want to see a sad author. I always tell children, if you want to see a sad author, it's an author who has no readers. And so I think the number one thing we can do is to tell people, buy the books, share the books, ask for the books when we go to wherever we buy our books from, so that they put them on the shelves and keep them stocked. That's the kind of work that can be done at the individual level that has, I think, really grand impact.
It's interesting you asked that question, and it's something which I have struggled with, because while Deanna is very good at, buy the book, it's very hard for me to say buy the book, because I come from maybe a different school of thought, or maybe it's a different generation, which says, you know, the minute it leaves you, it's no longer yours. You've put it on that platter, and now it's the universe. Will do what it needs to do, because you've put it on the platter, you have offered it to the people, you've offered it to the community, to the world. Now it's the effort of the one who wants to consume it. That effort is not my responsibility. I've done my bit of putting it on a beautiful platter and offering it to the universe. It's hard for me to, actually it's extremely challenging for me to say you need to buy the book. Because, you know, Professor Puran Singh is such an important figure in my life. And I related to that. I related to him, and that this man was this giant of thought. And if he was not recognized in his time period, who am I? So it's, you know, it's, for me, it's that. While I agree 100% with you, Deanna, and actually I would love it if people don't even buy it, just go to your libraries and ask for it.
Sure.
Have them buy it, you know, but that's what it is. But because I'm so attached to Puran Singh, you know, that it's a hard journey for me. But thank you for saying what you did, Deanna, because and that's what we do, is that something which is difficult for me to say, you said it, bravo, thank you, I honor it. And so
well,
tell us something.
I mean, just to be clear, I do also do what I profess. This is not something I'm just saying, right? Like this is something I believe in, not just, you know, my book, but all of them.
Great.
That's what, to Simran's point, like that's what's going to get people who have more power and authority to distribute and get them into, you know, Scholastic and all these places. The reason they'll do that, it's sort of, you know, what comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of a thing. Like in order for big publishers to take on this work and have more characters and have more representation, we have to show, like we have to be able to demonstrate that we're able to do it on our own too. And you help us create that case.
Yeah, I'll echo that point, Deanna. I think so to sort of take a step back, you know, I think if we're looking at this as a way of building community power and of doing seva for our communities, then first we recognize the problem. And the problem here is that, and I dealt with this firsthand as I started pitching books to publishers. No one's interested. No one wants a book about Sikhs. And the reason that they say that is there's no market. There's no proof of market. And the reason there's no proof of market is that this is the chicken and egg thing. Deanna's saying, like, no one's tried it. And so now we've tried it. We have these books out there, and now we have to show them that there is interest. And so it's not just about buying the book. If you can, that's great, and that's wonderful. But there are other really easy things you can do, like requesting your library or your local bookstores to stock them. That's really big. You can go on Amazon or other websites and rate and review the books. You can go to Goodreads and submit a review. Like, these are 2 to 5 minute tasks that you can do that make a significant incremental impact. And so, and just the last thing I'll say is Kaur Life, the blog, KAURLIFE.org, has this beautiful post about a listing of all the books with Sikh characters. And so you can sort of get a catalog and spend an hour and just knock out a bunch of reviews and give every single book a bump. And that's what we've done in our home, and I would encourage you all to do this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, everyone. I think for me, it seems like it's both the purchasing the book and taking those small incremental steps. It's also, of making that conscious choice to purchase a book from someone from within the community, which I think, as I look to buying presents for my little nieces and nephews, that's definitely something that wasn't available for me before. But now, as I'm exposed to this world and I engage in this conversation, it's an easy and wonderful present for a 3 to 4-year-old. So it makes my life a lot easier. Yeah, so maybe we do have one question from the audience. It is from a young member. My name is Deanna Singh, and I'm 12, and I live in New Jersey. Your books are so good. How do I make a children's book for everyone? No, that's a vast question, but I thought I would honor this and ask it to everyone.
So I would love to just share something really quick. First of all, Adit, that's amazing. And I'm so glad that you're thinking about entering into the world of storytelling. One of the things that we actually do with our children's books is I have 2 boys. They're 8 and 12 years old, and they actually run the children's book imprint. So our children's book imprint is called Story to Tell Books, and they're the ones who are responsible. So Adit, I always tell people they're my bosses. They're the co-chairman, excuse me, of the company. And so they get to make the decisions. And I go to them and to get a final approval for any books that we're going to put out. And one of the really exciting things that they decided to do was actually to write their own chapter book. So they're writing their own chapter book, and they're really talking about they're using a story. So it's all based in story, but they're sharing their opinion about immigration. So what I would tell you, I think the number one thing, that they did, and so they're almost finished. They're actually, they sent all their materials to the editor. So they're waiting to get their feedback back from the editor. But one of the things that I think they would start with is knowing what you want to tell your story about. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to decide what's the story that you want to tell. And what my kids did that I thought was so fun is they actually drew out their story. So they did what we call like a board. They did a storyboard, and they had big pieces of paper, and we had them, taped to the wall. So maybe ask an adult, but if they say it's okay, do something like this or put it in a notebook where you just kind of make it and you can draw it out. They were stick figures. These aren't beautiful drawings, but just to kind of think about, like, what does my storyline look like, right? What am I trying to achieve with my story? And once you start with that, then I think you can go into the writing process. And if you follow us, you'll be able to see they're going to do a big presentation, and it's going to be a free kind of thing that you can do with my kids. They're going to actually show you how they went from storyboard all the way through the editing process and finding the artist and kind of all of that in February. So if you connect with us or have an adult connect with us, would love to be able to share. But I'm just so excited to hear that you're thinking about going into this space.
But that's a great question, because wherever I go, I have all the kids want to write their own story. So I prepare these packets. I take 8.5, 11 sheet, about 15 of them, fold it, staple it, and that's what I give to the kids. I said, okay, now draw the story, because it's so much easier for them to draw, and then the words come later, because they're giggling over the stories, and I'm like, what is so funny about this? Because this animal is doing actually this, and they've got them shaped. So the imaginations are working. So for me, those are the priceless things, to make those, that drawing, Deanna, which you talked about. But it's so easy. Just take that paper, fold it, staple it, and there you go. That's your first step. And there'll be many, many, many. And the one thing I would tell him would be date it. Put a date on every story, because then you'll see your own journey. That's what I thought, but I don't think about it now. So to date your work is really wonderful. But congratulations, you're on it, and we're so excited that the next generation is right out there.
And we're ready to buy it.
Yes, we're ready to buy it. Well, yeah. We've got at least 4 people to buy that book.
Yeah, I think this is just like a great example of like opening up that space, creating that space for others to see themselves in this work and to be able to do this work. Which honestly, yeah, like even as I embark in my work, it is because there have been other people who have done it before me, and I see myself in those spaces. So it's great to see this like tangible example of this space that has been opened up for other individuals within the community. Another question we have, I will relegate this one to Simran Jeet. So this is from Gurpreet from Malaysia. Where do you see the future of Sikh-based storybooks heading to? And what advice would you give future Sikh authors/writers who are or will be writing more about Sikh representation? And I would invite everyone else to add to the question as well.
Yeah, please. I mean, I think the future is bright. I'm really excited. I think, 40, 50 years ago, we couldn't even imagine what a Sikh children's book would look like, or having a Sikh character in a children's book. 20 years ago, we started to see some of that through labors of love, people putting in their own income and working out of their garages and running from store to store to print and staple and bind and all these things. And now we're starting to break through. There is now, my book is with Penguin Random House. There's a beautiful book by Supriya Gailkar, The Many Colors of Harpreet Singh, that was published by Lee and Low Books, which is from Barnes & Noble. There is a new book coming out with Little Brown called Hair Twins by Rakhi Mirchandani, about a father and his daughter and their morning ritual of doing their hair together, a Sikh father and Sikh daughter. So, I mean, this is not an anomaly. This is not, something that's happened by accident. The community is really pushing and we're finding our ground. And so I'm really excited to see what comes next. The other thing I'll say that I really love about the space is, and this is not true in every industry, but in children's publishing, the people who are making it are really committed to helping other people who are interested. It's really hard to help for a lot of reasons, but those who I know, including the people who have helped me, are really supportive. And so if you're interested in doing this work, find those people and reach out and let them know you're thinking about it and you have a story. Would people be willing to review it? Will they be willing to make introductions? Will they, anything? But I really think this is a communal effort and we're all going to benefit. And most importantly, our kids are going to benefit. And so that's, I think, where things are headed and why I'm so excited about it. And I would also say this is true in other genres of writing as well, that it's not just children's literature. We're making ground in other fields as well. And we're starting to recognize, like a lot of marginalized communities, that we actually have things to contribute and people really want to hear from us. And so just know in your heart, even when the publishers or the agents say this is not relatable, just know that it is, know that you have something valuable and keep putting it out there. And eventually, and I'll just say it for myself, this was not an easy process to land where I landed. I'm grateful that I have, but don't feel like, you see a success and everything was perfect. I think it's a hard process for everyone, every author I've ever talked to. So just put in the work and be persistent.
Awesome. Thank you, Simran Jeet. And if anyone else wants to chime in, please do feel free. But
I do think, particularly from the last 10, 11 years, the number of Sikh children's books that have come up have accelerated. So that's great news. And, to Simran's point that, there are people, even if you get rejected, persevere. And the point is, what Simran was so right, because if you truly believe in it, don't wait for anybody else. And this is where, I want to tell the story of, when my father, when he was in Kuwait, he had come from India, and he loved to play cricket. And the Britisher, the Englishmen, as he calls them, did not want, of course, the Indian to play on his team. And he whined. I mean, he was probably 20. 21, and he whined to his father, they're not letting me play. They don't want me on their team. They don't want this. And my grandfather just turned around and said, so make your own team. I mean, it was that, just do that. And so he took the ship back to India and got gear for, I think, 4 teams and started his own team. So that's that spirit. Don't let anyone say that you can't do it or that your story is not worth it, even though you invest, because it'll make it easier for somebody else. And now, I mean, he has a team, he has a shield under his name. That's not the point. The point is you do it. Don't let anyone else define you. It's always been that you control your own story, you control your own narrative, and don't let anyone say that you can't do it and that your story is not worth it, because your story is worth it. So just go for it.
And I think it's also, it's a valid and relevant and also laborious process, but I think it's worth it. If anything, I think having the people in this conversation speak about their experiences, I think really illuminates that. And I know all of the panelists today in their own ways are either part of or interact with educational organizations. And I know in the chat, there's been some suggestions around how we can make these stories more accessible and available to the wider community. But I guess the general question I can throw to the panelists today is, how do we make sure that parents and educators and childcare workers in all capacities are engaging with and sharing these stories? Are there any ways that you've found particularly fruitful?
I think just making the suggestion can go a really long way. So I think one of the things that I have found to be really powerful from people all over the world is going and having those conversations, like Inni was saying, with your library and saying, you know what, I really would love to see more representation. Here's a list of books that would be great for you to showcase and to have as part of your collection. Going to your local, bookstore, whatever that might be, and saying, I mean, a lot of those decisions, right, are made by customers. And I think that oftentimes we leave that power on the table because we don't even ask. We don't say, I'd really like to see these books and a lot of these books being offered. I think another thing is with our teachers, just saying, hey, do you ever do anything that really features or focuses on the Sikh culture? Is it something that can I share some resources from you? From the Institute, from a variety of different organizations that support our work as Sikhs. Can I share some of this information with you? I think it'd be great for you to be able to incorporate it in some of the things that you're already doing in your classroom. These are all very, very simple asks. And quite frankly, especially if you come with the resource list, right? If you come with the materials, educators, that's what they love. They love getting material and they love being able to share it with young people. But if they might be just missing the connection between the two, and you can be that conduit.
I think the hesitation is, we like it or not, and I don't like to always fall back on this. But there is something resonant of the colonial culture where we feel that our books and our stories and narratives are not worthy for the mainstream. And that's a very hard bridge to take over. I mean, when I go to, homes and on their coffee table, I see books of every other country and European art and everything else. And I see nothing of Sikhs on that coffee table. It sends a very powerful message to the children that in your own home, if your coffee table does not have a book that represents who you are, that's the problem. That's a shift. And that's a hard shift. I don't know, Simran Jeet, if you have ever come across, because this for me has been a really troubling point within the community of how they are not they are not supporting their own brand, which is Sikhi, which is the faith, which is the Sikh culture, which is the Sikh literature. If the Sikhs themselves don't support it and do not embrace it and do not rejoice in it, it's difficult to push it through. So what is that prevents us from doing it? Meanwhile, we are talking about at the children's level, there's another level, right? This is really at the bottom of the totem pole. There's a lot that goes on before that. So, similar thoughts on that? What is it that prevents us?
I think you're right, and I think there's it's a collective psychology, and it's one that that we carry individually, and I'll be totally honest and say it's something that I've struggled with as well. And we all struggle with these things in various ways and at different levels. My struggle with it hasn't been, I'm proud of my tradition and have these things available in my home like that. That's never really been my struggle, but my struggle has very much been, do I have something to contribute? Do people care about our stories, and do people care about what I have to say? And that's, I mean, you're right. It's at various levels. Like I remember being in college and in graduate school and feeling so nervous about speaking up in class because I had those same questions, right? Do I have something to contribute? And it was all internalized, right? These are messages that we get from childhood, and social science research is showing us now the impact that these kinds of things have on us. That it's not just about representation, but all these other modalities of messaging that tell us you don't matter, right? Like I told this story recently. I remembered when I was a kid and asked a librarian. I was 6 or 7. I grew up in Texas, so I asked a librarian if there were any children's books with Sikhs or Punjabis in them, and they said it's not relatable. And I remember just being so upset by that and what that conveyed to me. And so like I pushed back, but also what happens, and this is like the way that we're talking about racism in this country, what happens when you're constantly weathering that storm, constantly being barraged by messages, implicit and explicit, saying you're not normal, you're not mainstream, you're not supposed to be represented. Like you can't help but take that in somehow. And so how do we overcome that? I think that's a real challenge. And again, I'm still struggling with that, and I'm pushing. But part of the solution for me is to look within our tradition and to see people like Guru Nanak who are not part of mainstream society saying, you know what, I have something special, I have a different perspective, and I'm going to share that with the world. And I believe that it matters. And for us to be walking in the footsteps of Guru Nanak, what does that mean? What does it look like for us to really embrace our distinctiveness with confidence, but also with humility? And I think that's such a tough line to balance. Usually we don't see that in our world, right? Either you have confidence or you have humility. But it's something that our gurus lived, and I think that's something that we have to learn how to strike that balance as well.
Yeah, I think a narrative that I'm hearing here is both representation on a grander scale, but also representation and support within our communities. So a question I have, this one I'll throw it to Deanna, but everyone please feel free to chime in. I know in your work you speak about bridge building through division, and the role that children's books can play in this endeavor. So in today's climate, in this post-election world, when like perhaps a bridge that was severed is starting to be built again. I'm trying to work with your build bridging. So yeah, be patient with me. How can we so in a world where this bridge has perhaps been severed and it's like we see it kind of being built again, how can we ensure that this bridge is built? And not only on a grander within other communities or seeing representation from other communities, but also within our communities. So building bridges within, which I know you mentioned and brought up. So yeah, I guess the vastness and nuance of bridge building, how do we ensure it happens?
It's so interesting because I have spent my entire life working, as an activist, working with different groups, really talking about this bridge building programs, law, business, like all the different sectors, all these things. And what's so fascinating, I love to tell people this, but the first book that I wrote was called I Am a Boy of Color. So the first children's book I wrote was called I'm a Boy of Color. Then I wrote a children's book called I Am a Girl of Color. And then I wrote Cloth Crown, right? So these are the three books. And what's been one of the most like fascinating aha, duh kind of moments for me, like both an aha and like a duh, of course moments, is that by having a children's book, I have been able to have some of the deepest, most profound, most, I think, engaging, most challenging conversations. Because when you show a book and it's got just a beautiful child on the book, right? And it's a children's book, it's something that's accessible. What happens is that people put their guards down. People think, oh, I know a children's book, right? It's different than if you show a textbook. Then people kind of are like, oh, am I going to be able to handle this? Or, a novel. Oh, is this going to be too, whatever, too much of a story that I can't relate to? But a children's book, oh, I know a children's book. I can get behind a children's book, right? That's simple. That's not going to require me to have hours and hours and hours. I can do that relatively quickly. I can read that. And what's just so fascinating is that people will take it and they put down their guards are not up. And then they start to read through the stories. And you start to see this transformation and they start to ask questions. And so it becomes this amazing way to build a bridge because people are open to it. Because people want to get connected to the children that are depicted in the story. They want to understand the artwork and they want to understand what's happening and they want to empathize with that child or what's going on. And so I think it's just been fascinating to me how much I'm able to do and have these difficult conversations and through something that's just beautiful, right? That's just has art at its core and that has and is based in literature and storytelling. So I think that when I think about bridge building, I think that one of the number one things, we talked a lot on this call about empathy, but one of the number one things you do is you build that empathy. And a children's book is like a fast, easy, accessible, but really, really powerful way to kind of engage people on this process of starting empathy. And if your bridge is built on empathy, then it will withstand, right? It'll withstand COVID. It will withstand having different political views. It will, if it's built on empathy, it can withstand the pressures that come from the world that we can't even anticipate right now.
Right. And I echo that with you, Deanna, what you said about, I know Daddy's Turban particularly was a book that has been doing very well in schools because it was, because when the teachers saw it, they said, we never even thought about a little boy wanting to be just like his dad. Duh. I mean, of course.
Right.
Why would you? And that's that thinking shift,
Yeah.
And that little boy is struggling with tying the dastar because he wants to look just as grand as his father. And, and he's struggling with it and all that. But it was and then it got to be, the conversation. Okay, so there's the dastar. So it's not just a turban. So it's the fabric. You build that through the eyes of the little boy. And it's non-threatening. It's not somebody coming into your class and giving you a long lecture. It's actually but a child. Like he wants to look just like his father. And which child doesn't want to look like his parent? A little boy or a little girl. And that's, for me, has been one of those stories that has been really the way the educators have been able to take that story into their classrooms where they have a boy who's wearing a dastar and be able to show it. So it became a question like, did you go through the same? Is that what you do at home?
Yeah.
That became that conversation where all of a sudden, instead of what is that on your head, to wow, that, so it changes that narrative. It puts the power in, and it's an easy tool. Educators need tools to be able to convey in a meaningful way, in a non-threatening way to their children. And this is that medium, the literature, the books are that medium that goes to them. So we think of, I'm sure all of us, I know for sure, look at these as tools which we are putting in the hands of the educators.
That's right.
Because we can definitely not be in every school, but these books can, and they take it to a different level. Mm-hmm. And the educators will use it to the best of their capacity because they are trained to think when they look at books like this, how we can best use that so that the entire class, the community, everyone feels welcome and everybody feels that they have a say and they are actually of the same weight. Not one group is weighed more than the other.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank you. I think, yes, I definitely agree with the accessibility of children's books and kind of maybe the absence of a supposed agenda, and just, yeah, having the space to tell a story. Before we wrap up our conversation, we do have one last question. And if we have any, and by we, I mean the panelists, if the panelists have any final remarks that they would like to add with that question, please do. So our last question is from Harkirat Singh from New Jersey. They ask, I recently saw some very good quotes from a video game series, and one of these quotes was, yesterday's enemies are today's recruits. Train them to fight alongside you and pray they eventually don't decide to hate you for it. And this reminded them of Sikhi. We make friends even though they are enemies. And I found this in many stories, even in some children's books. Is this what we have to follow in our lives? Or perhaps we can all reflect and think about this question that Harkirat has posed.
So in The Cloth Crown, I think we kind of hit on this topic because the little boy in the story is being teased because of his barka, and he comes home and he's like wrestling with the question, should I cut my hair or should I not cut my hair? And his father actually, says, let me tell you why. Let me tell you my own story of this experience so that you know that you're not alone. But let me also tell you why I wear my turban, like what it means to me. And then the young man's in his story is able to say, like, I had the same moment. And then I decided that I wasn't going to cut my hair, but I decided I was going to try and teach the people who had bullied me, right? Like why it's important to me, like why I actually do this. And as I was like writing the story, as I read it to other children, as, I even saw my own, father looking at the story, you feel this sense of pride, right? This moment where it's like, let me use this moment where maybe it feels painful, but let me use this moment as an educational moment, right? Like, let me use this moment to say, maybe the reason why you're bullying me or you're, which is awful and terrible, and I'm not saying everybody has to do and respond in this way, but let me, in this moment, use this as an opportunity to educate and to say, no, this is bigger than, maybe you just feel uncomfortable. Well, I'm just going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Like, I'm not going to even call you my enemy. I'm just going to think that maybe you feel uncomfortable and you're lashing out at me because you feel uncomfortable. Let me use that discomfort to actually educate you on why this is so important. Let me see if I can really get to the places that will pull at your heart. And I think that that's the power, right? Like that if we come to people and we're like, rah, 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 you're bad, or you better listen to me, or here's what what you're doing wrong. Are you going to change anybody? Not really. But if you come at them and you say, can I just show you the human side of me? And can I see the human side of you? Can I connect with who you are and why you believe the things that you believe? And can I show you my own story and why I believe? That's where I think hearts and minds change, right? Like, I think that's where we have the real power. So I love, reading Inni's work. I love reading Simran's work because you can feel that there's this educational component, even if it's not like I'm going to hit you over the head with it, that even in the stories, there's this educational component of, no, I'm proud of who I am. And this is important for me to be able to show up in this way. And I would love for those of you who are on the periphery, who might think about, us and want to put us in a different box. I would love for you to remove that box and to come over here and let me come over there and let's build a bridge to each other. That's real power and real change.
It was interesting when, Maglinda, when you were talking about, the question had enemies, enemies, enemies so many times repeated. And all I could think about was, there are no enemies in Sikhi. We are one. There is no stranger, right? Yeah. So even this idea of the word choice of enemy is just not there. And that go back to the principle of the faith, of the oneness, of, incorporating that, putting that out there. It is such a foreign concept, because of the interfaith work that also I do, and I'm sure Simran Jeet also could speak to that this idea that there is that the light is an all and that light is the same is mind-blowing. Sab mein jyot, jyot hai soi. I mean, it literally shocks the interfaith world when I speak about it. And then you bring that down, and that's actually now going to be the focus of my work, is to take that particular principle and apply it to every book that I am going to be doing for the mainstream. That oneness, without even using any of the Sikh terminology, but that's the framework. So going forward, if you ask what is that's because in this today's day and age, that is what I feel the message of Guru Nanak Sahib is so important. And to bring that in ways, shapes, and forms which people can handle. And I think children's books are the easiest way, because if the child grows up reading that, believing that, we are winning. The world is winning. Everything that you learn up to the age of 10 is absorbed in your subconscious. You don't even understand. Anything after that, you have to work at getting rid of. And it's too late by the age of 10, sad to say. So we have that window of working with, with the children for the coming generations. And I'm so looking forward to that work. Truly excited to be able to do something magical there with that principle of Inni Kaur.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'll just add to that. I no disagreements here, and I think Harkirat, your question is a great one, because in this context where our world is so polarized, we're living in the same kinds of binaries that our gurus questioned, and what they said was, it doesn't have to be this way, right? Like this idea of friend versus enemy is not one that is so it doesn't work with my understanding of Sikhi. And I look at Guru Tegh Bahadur, as an example for a lot of this type of work in this moment, and trying to understand what does it look like in a world where people hate you for whatever reason, and you don't want to hate them. And what does it take to get there? And so what Inni just shared is a beautiful and really helpful, practical way of reimagining that. And some of the principles that I take Guru Tegh Bahadur's life an example, right? He says, Sukh dukh je par se nahi, lobh moh abhiman kaun anik sun remana somurat bhagwan, right? That's in Salok Mahalla Nova. And what he's destroying our senses of binaries. He follows that up by saying, Ustat nindya nahi jehe kanchan lo saman. He follows that up by saying, Harak sog ja ke nahi bari meet saman, right? So he's saying, like in this one, someone who's not affected by pleasure or pain. Harak sog ja ke nahi bari meet saman. Someone who sees friends and enemies. Bari, enemies, friends, meet saman. Sees them as the same. Nanak Sahib says, listen, oh my mind, those people are the truly liberated people. So what does liberation look like? Liberation for us looks like going beyond these binaries of good and bad, of friend and enemy, and being able to say, you may hate me, but I can find a way to connect with you and maybe even bring you along into connection. And I think that's what storytelling has the power to do, right? By introducing people to a book, kids to a character who they wouldn't otherwise know, and just connecting with them on a human level through their life story, like that's real empathy and that's real connection. And so I think I'm just trying to echo what I'm hearing from Inni Ji and from Deanna. Like, that's what this work does. That's what these books do. And that's also like what, as a parent, I want to do for my kids. I want them to be able to learn to see the humanity in everyone that they meet, because that seems like a good life, right? Like that's where liberation comes. You're not weighed down by anger or any sort of hatred or toxicity that just creates so much pain in our lives. So I think, to to me, that's the value of this kind of storytelling, and how we can make it align with our statistics.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all of our presenters today. I think what I heard in this last question was honestly a lot of bridge building, whether it be between the binaries to find the connection between the two ends, perhaps, and the bridge building between communities, both internally and externally, and moving from that discomfort that perhaps occurs in some of our experiences, and kind of liberating it towards action, which I think there's a lot of in between, but that's I think how the bridge gets built, or at least in my understanding, from what I've picked up in this conversation today, is what I'll leave with, I think. And just so the audience knows, I have put some links in our chat box. So if you'd like to engage with some of Deanna Singh's work further, I have thrown a link in for a 3-day virtual summit that she will be hosting. And if you would like to purchase any of the books that have been mentioned here today, and some that haven't been, I have put the links for the virtual stores, for the online stores, in there as well. So just to wrap up today's conversation, I would like to remind everyone that the Sikh Research Institute hosts monthly live webinars. Join us in conversation on December 5th for Bhavir Singh's 148th birthday with scholar Nikki Guninder Kaur Singh, author, poet, and artist Inni Kaur, who you already know, and educator Simran Singh as they discuss the poetry, the Gurbani, and the everlasting inspiration of Bhavir Singh. And lastly, don't forget to tune to the Sikh Cast, a podcast produced by Sikri, where we explore the various issues and events affecting Sikhs worldwide. Thank you again so much to all of our panelists for joining us today. Today's webinar will be ending now. Vaigu Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaigu Ji Ki Fateh.